All right, welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon to celebrate the life of Dave Robertson. Dave was Curator's Distinguished Teaching Professor of Political Science here at the University of Missouri St. Louis. My name is David Kimball. I'm the Interim Chair of Political Science here at UMSL. I'll be playing the role of host for this celebration to honor our beloved colleague. Just a couple of quick housekeeping items before we share about Dave. So first is we are recording this session to share it with those who could not be here today. If you'd like a copy of the recording, please contact me. I just put my email address in the chat. And then the second thing is UMSL's created a memorial website where you can share memories of Dave and make a donation to a scholarship named after him. And I'll post that, a link to that in the chat as well. We've invited several people who knew Dave well to speak about his many roles as a beloved colleague, teacher, scholar, mentor, institution builder, and friend. I've probably left out many more descriptions there. I know many more of you may have stories to share, so please do use the memorial page to share them. And I'm going to get started with our program here. So I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Kristen Sobolik, Chancellor of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Kimball, for organizing this virtual life celebration in honor of David Robertson, our colleague, friend, and mentor, and who we all agree was the very best of human beings. When I learned of Dave's death, I was saddened as he had just recently left the University of Missouri St. Louis and moved to Arizona to enjoy a well-earned retirement. His illness, his death were sudden, adding to the shock I know we all experienced. My thoughts and prayers then and now are with his wife, Kathy, and son, Brian. Their loss is immeasurable. Dave was very well known, well-liked, and well-respected throughout the university, the state, and the nation. In fact, in this meeting today, we have people from across the nation, including from my own first faculty appointment at the University of Maine, where I had the privilege of working in the dean's office with Dr. Amy Freed, professor of political science, who is here today, I think, in one of the boxes. Hi, Amy. Dave was always generous with his time and his talents, as many of us on this call can attest. He was an outstanding researcher, scholar, writer, mentor, and commentator. But ultimately, at the heart of everything, Dave was a world-class educator who shared his knowledge of politics and life with generations of students, with countless reporters, and even with more than a few college administrators, including me. David Robertson came to the University of Missouri St. Louis as an assistant professor in 1983. He earned tenure in 1989, was promoted to full professor in 2001, and received his appointment to Curator's Distinguished Teaching Professor in 2008. He chaired the Political Science Department from 1998 to 2001, and again from 2015 until this past August. Among his many career honors were the Governor's Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2001. Doesn't get much better than that. And Chancellor's and Emerson Electric Awards for Excellence in Teaching in 2002. Dave, a nationally recognized scholar of American political development, was an oft-quoted voice on politics across the state of Missouri and beyond. He provided regular analysis on the pages of newspapers around the country and on the airwaves of St. Louis Public Radio and KSDK, Channel 5, serving as that station's official political analyst for 18 years, from 2000 to 2018. In fact, upon his death, numerous reporters from around the country reached out to our public relations department and to me personally to share their condolences and to express their appreciation for the many years that Dave not only provided them with quotes, but also with background and context and knowledge that they in turn were able to share with their audiences, making them better informed citizens. Reporters by nature are a little jaded and somewhat, sometimes downright cantankerous, which made their unsolicited comments about Dave all the more impressive. He was a go-to guy for reporters because of his objective knowledge and the patience in which he shared his knowledge and opinions. I am delighted to see that Dave's colleagues in the Department of Political Science have initiated a campaign to establish the David Robertson Memorial Scholarship in Political Science, not just because it honors Dave, but also because it will help deserving students follow in his footsteps. My husband, Scott, and I have contributed to the scholarship, and I've encouraged our fundraising department to make it a priority to promote this scholarship among our alumni and employees, regardless of their home department. Dave was a campus-wide treasure whose accomplishments reflected well upon us all, and I'm certain there are many, many people who will want to contribute to his legacy as an outstanding faculty member and a better person. At a time when the need for an informed and engaged citizenry has never been higher, we should all be grateful Dave was able to share as much knowledge and enthusiasm as he did with students throughout his life and career. And at a time when we have a crucial need for more compassion, positivity, and true human caring, we all have no better role model than David Brian Robertson. He was simply the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. Next, I would like to introduce Theda Scotchpole, who is Director of Scholar Strategy Network and the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University.
Thank you, David. And let me just say that it's moving and an honor to be with so many of you, particularly at the University of Missouri, who knew and loved David Robertson and worked with him. As a member of the political science profession and a historical institutional political scientist myself, I have known about Dave's work and interacted with him at year after year at political science meetings and meetings of the politics and history section that we both were involved in with many others in building. But I got to know him best as one of the founding members of the Scholars Strategy Network, which I have had the privilege to direct and help to build with many other colleagues. It is an association now close to 2,000 academics at universities and colleges all over the United States, with more than 40 chapters all around the United States, dedicated to the proposition that people who teach and do research in universities should be prepared to share their insights, their knowledge with fellow citizens, with policymakers, with media outlets, with civic groups, in plain English and in a mutually engaged and respectful way. There is no one at all who embodies those ideals more thoroughly than Dave Robertson. And he was a founding member of the national network, and with Dave Kimball and other colleagues in Lower Illinois and Missouri helped to found and build the Confluence chapter, which is one of our earliest chapters and one of our most active chapters. I remember traveling to the area and meeting with the group at the pub where the monthly meetings occur. And over the years, Dave played a big role in publishing op-eds in the newspapers, arranging a forum about the Ryan budget, responding to the Ferguson crisis, and getting academics and students involved in thinking about how to further racial justice in that crisis and beyond. And I want to conclude by quoting Dave's own words in a July 2017 contribution to the newspaper, to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, where he was arguing on behalf of Clean Missouri reforms, because I think they capture the way in which he had a genuine passion for American constitutionalism and democracy, and was able to weave a sense of his personal commitment together with his knowledge in a way that could reach people across all kinds of lines of difference. As an idealistic kid, he wrote, democracy was my inspiration. I loved the Declaration of Independence, and in high school, I carried around a booklet of quotations about democracy. I have always despised dictatorships in novels like 1984, in the histories of Hitler and Stalin, and in too many foreign nations in our time. I understand the virtues of Republican government much better than I did then. I deeply appreciate our constitutional government for giving the people the final authority to drive the government through their elected representatives. But I am deeply worried about all of that now. He goes on to describe a kind of political eclipse that Americans are experiencing, talking about big money contributions, gerrymandering. This creeping darkness is eating away at our faith in our system of government, he said. Worse, we tolerate that corrosion all too readily as blind partisanship drives us apart. And I'll conclude as he did by quoting his final sentence. I stand against the darkness enveloping our democracy, and I hope the people of Missouri will stand against it too. We can change this. This message needs to reach all Americans and people who love America around the world and love democracy. And I am certain that Dave's message will continue to resonate through the colleagues and students he inspired, and do just that in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Theda. And yeah, a very timely quotation from Dave there. Next, I would like to introduce Todd Swanstrom, who is the E. Desmond Lee Endowed Professor in Community Collaboration and Public Policy here at UMSL.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about my friend and colleague, Dave Robertson. For the family who are on this call, I hope you get a real sense of how much we respected Dave and his work, and how much we loved him at the university, and that's not too strong a word. It's a sad time, of course, but it's also a very happy time in a way to celebrate his exuberant life and impressive legacy. So I'm going to emphasize one thing. Dave was devoted to the University of Missouri St. Louis as a metropolitan research university that could serve as a ladder of upward mobility for working class and minority students, many of whom were the first generation of their family to attend college. He was devoted to that mission. For example, just as one factoid, which we're very proud of in the Department of Political Science, 25% of our most recent 36 PhDs were African-American. And with all due respect, Theda, I think I've looked at the numbers and we outdo Harvard here. So and Dave was obviously a very important part of that achievement. He mentored many, if not most, of those minority PhDs, and was patient and attentive and supportive to the extreme. And it was a pleasure to work with Dave on many of those PhDs. Dave also took on the chairmanship. As Kristen mentioned, he took on a second stint as chairman of the Department of Political Science, frankly, at a time where we had a great deal of tension. Those of you in academia know that departments sometimes can have a certain amount of stress and tension, and we had it at one point in our history. And Dave took on what I considered at the time to be a thankless task, frankly. And he handled it with extraordinary equanimity. He bent over backwards to make sure everyone could be heard. It was fair to all parts of the department. And finally, and I'm sure many of you will resonate with this, his droll sense of humor was absolutely, effective at times at breaking the tension in the room. I wish I could come up with a good example of Dave's humor, but you all know what I'm talking about. He had a dry sense of humor that almost defied you to laugh after he told it, but invariably broke the tension in the room. I've often thought since then, what would we have done without Dave, the Department of Political Science? He performed an invaluable function. And I can say now that Dave has left a legacy, a better university, and a better department. I can honestly say that we've entered an era of good feelings, so to speak, in the department, partly his response to Dave's effective leadership. So let me just conclude by saying thank you, Dave, and we miss you.
Very nice.
Thank you very much, Todd. Next, I would like to introduce Suzanne Mettler, the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions at Cornell University.
Thank you, David, for organizing this and bringing us all together. And I'm so honored to have the chance to speak about our good friend, Dave. As we all know, Dave was a prolific and deeply insightful political scientist and a public-oriented scholar who put his knowledge to the service of society, and an extraordinary human being who emanated kindness, warmth, and integrity. I first became acquainted with Dave through a scholarship. When I was writing my dissertation, I discovered his work on American federalism and how it mattered for public policy. And his work transformed how I understood what I was studying. Not long after that, I was fortunate to meet Dave in person. I'll never forget how overwhelmed I was early on as a graduate student and as an assistant professor when I would attend the annual conference of the American Political Science Association. Between the thousands of people in suits who kept streaming past me and the thick program listing hundreds of panels, it all seemed quite intimidating and alienating. But somehow I found my way to the business meeting of the politics and history section, and I was riveted. Here was this genuine community of scholars, of brilliant people who were also warm and funny and spirited. And there was one key person among them, clearly the backbone of the section, who made it all come together and work. And that was Dave. And Dave particularly welcomed me in and helped me to find a home in political science. Over the next several years, he invited me to serve on panels or write summaries of conference papers for Clio, our section newsletter that he edited, and numerous other things. Quite simply, I can't imagine my career unfolding as it did without his generosity. And I know he did this for so many of us. He did it quietly and with his characteristic kindness. With each new publication of Dave's, I learned so much. He had a profound understanding of American history and institutions. His deeply researched books on the Constitution, federalism, labor, and public policy are fresh and innovative, and they provide a guide to those who seek to build a better world. I consider them must-reads for aspiring reformers. Let me quote from his book, The Constitution and America's Destiny. Dave writes, "The Constitutional Convention produced an American government that is hard to use. Idealists must grasp with this reality as a challenge and resolve to develop the politics necessary to make the Constitution work. It invites them and it needs them to build the exceptionally broad, strong, and durable coalitions required to overcome its hurdles and resist its frustrations. Making the politics that make this government work is arduous. Frequently, it seems impossible, but it is not. It is not cynical to believe that our well-being depends on how well our idealists make politics. It is the last true measure of idealism. Dave brought these insights to the broader public as a founding member of the Scholar Strategy Network and as a teacher. In recent years, I often gained tips from him about teaching the large Intro to American Politics course, to which I know he was so devoted. And he was also a wellspring of knowledge about heartland politics and what was happening on the ground. And I know he contributed that back to the community as well. As American politics became increasingly rocky in recent years, I sought out Dave's insight because I deeply trusted his judgment. In an email he wrote to me a few years ago, he said this, and I quote, "The United States is facing the test that Madison helped build the Constitution to meet. Primal fears in a democracy leading to a demagogic autocrat who wants to consolidate the powers to make law, execute law, and judge the law without any challenges. I think Americans have the character to stand up to this and are showing it in a lot of ways. It's going to be rough going, but I choose to be optimistic about American democracy and the sheer orneriness of the American people." End of the quote. I'm going to miss Dave so much, but I'll always keep learning from his scholarship and from his extraordinary example as a mentor and a public-facing intellectual, and not least from his hope. Rest in peace, my friend. I've been so lucky to know you.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Yes, Dave was an optimist. Next, I would like to introduce Ann Winkler, Chair and Professor of Economics here at UMSL.
Thanks, David. I just want to say I'm truly honored to be asked to participate today. And thank you, David. And I want to just start by expressing my deepest sympathies to the Robertson family. For those who don't know, I came to know Dave best as a chair over the last 5 or so years. And at the Dean's Policy Committee meetings, back before COVID, we always sat next to each other. Dave in the first seat on the far side of the table, and me right next to him. And sometimes we passed a note, but not too much. And we walked back together. Dave was also my MPPA colleague, and also will be relevant in a moment. He often sent me separate emails since I'm in the MPPA program, but not a regular faculty member in political science. And what I wanted to do today was to share an exchange that Dave and I had on June 17th. Dave wrote to me separately, "Ann, you almost certainly have heard this already. I'm going to retire on September 1st. As I looked at the budget scenarios, I felt that the only way to protect our department was to retire. I only had 1 year left on my term anyway. David Kimball will step in as an interim chair. The transition should be seamless for you and Monet, who is our business support specialist. Let me interject and say, look at Dave, caring about others, caring about me and Monet and how his transition affected us. My response at the time, wow, in capital letters. It is a huge loss for political science at MPPA, also bolded at the time, but I am hoping that you will stay involved like Terry has done. Speaking for MPPA, that would be really valuable. I again want to say this is a huge loss. It is a Terry-sized loss of human capital. You have been a major player for political science for a long time and have served the unit well. Back to MPPA, I really appreciate that you work to put in bylaws that do not assume that you will be chair forever." How prescient was he? And you made what could have been a really difficult transition a much smoother one. I know that it is not possible to celebrate you and your accomplishments yet, but I very much want to be there to honor you. And let me interject again. And I want to say in real time, I am so sorry that we are not celebrating today with Dave. I know I'm not alone in feeling like that. Dave wrote back to me, "Thank you, Anne. Those are very nice things to say." Gosh, that sounds like Dave. "I am so sorry that we are not," oh, he said, okay, so I lost my place here. "Those are very nice things to say. I can't always remember in the moment if I told people who I want to tell or not." Let me again interject, Dave being Dave, so humble and so gracious. Now I want to tell you what I wish I had added to that email exchange, though I'm glad I did what I did. Dave, diplomatic, always respectful, always tactful, in a way that I don't know how to fully be. He always had a way to get the same thing accomplished, and I told him this a number of times, but a kinder and gentler way of doing it. One of the good guys. That's a description that one of my colleagues used after I forwarded the email about Dave's passing. And I want to say to Dave's family that every single one of the past chairs of economics wrote me back promptly. Don Cradell, Susan Fagenbaum, Dave Rose, Bob Sorensen, Mike Allison, with expressions like "one of the nice guys," "nice guy," "I really liked him," "good guy." These statements are high praise in academia, whereas the saying goes, more or less, the politics can be so vicious and the stakes so small. You know, yay to Dave. Dave cared deeply about UMSL. And what strikes me so much about Dave is Dave was never in it for Dave. Dave was a champion for students. Dave was the consummate colleague as well. And I just want to conclude with this, and I think it's been said, but it can't be said enough. I'm a better colleague for having worked with Dave. And I am truly so glad that Dave's legacy will live on with the Dave Robertson Memorial Scholarship. I'm really, really happy for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Anne. Next, I would like to introduce Philip Rocco, an assistant professor of political science at Marquette University.
Thank you, Dave, for the invitation to speak, and my condolences to the Robertson family. It's a great honor and also a tremendous sadness to be with you today. But among the many other great things about Dave Robertson, he exuded this warmth and compassion and optimism in the midst of sadness and darkness. And it's really hard to live up to Dave's example, but I'm going to try to do my best. And I want to tell you about 3 times I met Dave. I first met Dave while sitting in the living room of my damp little bungalow on the southwest side of Berkeley. It was roughly 1 week into graduate school, and I was more or less convinced that I'd chosen the wrong career. I was trying to be a self-styled APD person, but what I think I meant was that I studied the state and had little to do with Stata. And in any case, I was finding out that I was not going to be a mainstream political scientist, whatever that means. But all of this was before I had opened the JSTOR cover page on Dave's 2005 APSR article, Madison's Opponents in Constitutional Design. I read the first sentence and I was thinking, this is the first sentence of an APSR article? This is amazing. And I was never really the same. And I want to read you that sentence now. Quote, "Understanding American politics since 1789 requires a clear understanding of the founders' reasons for designing the Constitution the way they did." Isn't that a great first sentence? Reading it now, years later, it strikes me how much that sentence captures about the importance of Dave's scholarship, as well as the imprint that he left on our profession and who Dave was to me, and I think so many of us. There are so many articles and books in our field that redound to the conclusion that institutions matter in shaping American politics. But Dave's scholarship on the Constitution and on federalism remind us that institutions come from somewhere, real human beings with passions and preferences, to use Richard Betzel's phrase, make and remake the rules that govern our lives. And if there's one overriding reason why I continue to teach Dave's work to my undergraduates, it's because he treats the creation of political institutions as the lively human enterprise it very much is. And at a moment of political turbulence, it's Dave's perspective and not the static state textbook versions of American Politics 101 that I and my students continue to find valuable, because they help us understand what's going on. institutions like federalism, as Dave has reminded me again and again, are not fixed constants, but fluid variables subject to the forces of time and temperature, and most of all, the work of human hands. And the notion that institutions are constituted by the labor of passionate human beings will be no surprise to anyone who knew Dave. So I want to tell you about the second time that I met Dave. Again, was not in person, but it was through the immense, assiduously organized reading lists that Dave so lovingly prepared and that graduate students in our field throughout the country I know use during their comprehensive exams. And I have to tell you, I still use them when I'm preparing syllabi. What kind of person, I thought, would put all of this together? Who was this ray of light in the sad life of the graduate student? The same person, I would later found out, who championed the APSA politics and history section in the Clio newsletter throughout the wilds of the 1980s. Dave, in short, was instrumental in building and maintaining the institutions he wanted to see in the profession. In addition to being a great thinker, he often did the uncompensated, unglamorous, and uncelebrated work of institution building, the same institution building that he described in his scholarship. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. But if I knew Dave by reputation to be a selfless builder of the road that I walked, nothing made it click more than the first time I met him. The setting was a policy history conference in Richmond, Virginia. I was a nervous, anxious graduate student. I emailed him if he would chat about my dissertation. He quickly obliged. He was one of 3 attendees in a panel I had organized and had spent much of the Q&A giving at least as much feedback as the discussant, if not more, and better feedback, I think. And Dave had this way of making you feel like your crummy seminar paper had all of the promise you imagined it might have when you started writing it. He had this way of returning life to enjoy to an idea, even if you felt that your critics or the critic in your head had beaten it into submission. And it was this ethic of taking other scholars, especially younger scholars, seriously that made Dave an inimitable mentor and teacher. He never skimped on criticism, mind you, but he also made it explicit that the criticism came from a place of camaraderie and solidarity. And I resolved then not to let a single conference pass me by without having lunch or coffee with Dave. The kind of friendship that I had with him and that he had invariably with so many others made being in this profession worth the price of admission. And without his spirit, I don't think we'd have much of a profession worth talking about. In other words, I'd submit that Dave embodied the conditions under which institutions work. Dave's character as a scholar and a mentor was reflected in the public values he held, which Thea had already talked about, especially in the work he did with Confluence chapter of SSN. Dave believed in authentic democracy and the power of government to transform the lives of the poor, to safeguard the rights of workers, and to address environmental threats. He fought for the things that he believed in, and he used all the power that an academic can possibly have to do that. He did not rest. I often wondered if Dave slept. And he more than once reminded me that the rigorous scholar and the political activist were by no means conflicting identities. At some point in the last few years, Dave started jokingly greeting me when he would see me with the phrase, "How's the rabble, Rouser?" That's the Dave wry humor. Needless to say, I miss Dave's voice, I miss his big laugh, and I miss his smile. His life is a testament to the fact that while we might take institutions for granted, that's what makes them institutions, the people who constitute them, the people who imbue them with meaning, the people who give them their transformative potential can't be forgotten. And I will never forget you, Dave.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think many of Dave's former students have been instructed on the importance of the first sentence. Next, I would like to introduce Susan Jufrida Mason Clark, Professor Emerita, Boise State University. Susan also earned her PhD in political science here at UPSL, and her advisor was Dave Robertson.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for the introduction. And yes, I had great fortune to be a student of Dave's, for him to be my dissertation advisor. You know, Dave was not only generous with his time and a great mentor, he was exemplar in modeling what good scholarship looks like. He was also a great teacher in and out of the classroom. Students appreciated Dave and the way he taught. He helped us see for ourselves how politics mattered and why it was a good thing. He never told us what was right or wrong. Rather, he challenged us to examine things, to examine our assumptions, to examine other perspectives, and of course, the counterfactual argument. He never pushed you beyond where you would go, but he always pushed you to go a little further. Dave excelled in teaching, both with graduates and undergraduate students. He not only won awards for it, but also mentored others like myself on how to reach students successfully in the classroom. Dave always made time for students, and when you had a meeting with him, you knew you had his undivided attention. He always turned away from the computer and faced you, and if someone were to knock and need him, which inevitably we all did at one point or time, he would answer the door but say that he was with someone, and when you were there, you were his number one. Dave treated graduate students like young scholars. I recall after months of him reviewing my draft dissertation chapters, he asked if I would read his draft chapter on what was not yet titled book, but it was about Madison and the Constitution. And although I didn't have the background to speak to the content, I could look for clarity in typos, and I happily took the opportunity to return the favor. Another time, I made a compelling argument based on some work Greco had done, and I found that the source was novel and as well as the perspective. Dave asked me if he minded if he used it as well. I was surprised because I clearly thought anyone was free to cite any other author. But what I felt he was really trying to tell me was I was making worthy arguments and that I had found something worth replicating or also using, and at the same time demonstrating to me how academics show respect to one another. As you all probably know, Dave loved a good pun. And 1 week after yet another draft of my dissertation was due, I was not really ready to release it. So I left him a draft Guinness beer in his mailbox instead. I was hoping he would at least appreciate my attempt to be punny about it. Long after I graduated, I would send him a string of puns that came my way via email. Any string of puns that came my way via email. He would always comment on the ones he liked and send me a new one for my own collection. Perhaps the thing I'm most grateful for is that he was both my dissertation advisor and a friend. I credit Dave with helping me make my career happen in academia. As well, after that, he was a trusted advisor, not just in how to write a chapter and make a compelling argument, but how to negotiate the politics of academia and excel. I'm certain my academic career would not have been as full, and my ability to shift to becoming an applied researcher not as smooth, had it not been for Dave and the integral and foundational part of my learning and how to grow as an academic and a professional. I'm forever grateful he said yes when I asked him, will you be my dissertation advisor? The things I've learned from Dave, his friendship and punny ways will continue to warm my heart and bring smiles to me. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about him.
Thank you very much, Susan. I would next like to introduce Terry Jones, Professor Emeritus of Political Science here at UMSL.
Hello, everyone. Dave loves sports, especially baseball. It was one of the many interests he and I both shared. In baseball, most players help their team through their individual accomplishments, slugging home runs or striking out lots of batters. But that is most of what they contribute. A few not only produce at the plate or on the mound, they also add a much rarer quality. They make their teammates better. Dave Robertson made all of his teammates better, much better. And Dave's team was large, his UMSL colleagues, the scholars throughout the globe, citizens who read his quotes and watched him on TV, but most of all, his students. Each is better today because they were on Dave's team. In our almost 40 years together at UMSL, Dave, time and again, I would watch as he helped students and colleagues, including this one, form or convert half-formed ideas into well-articulated projects. This is great, he would say, just great. Then, after a pause, he would add, but have you thought about, and that would be followed by very apt advice, always spot on. Dave was both a nurturing cheerleader and an intriguing and an inspiring coach. He brought out the best in everyone. The enormous good Dave provided never sought a spotlight. That was not Dave. Just this summer, as Ann Winkler has related, he quietly advanced his retirement so that the political science department could avoid major cuts. That was what was best, as Dave saw it and others, for his students and his colleagues. It was a classic Dave decision. Kathy, Brian, Elizabeth, Hunter, you are the core of Dave's family. You are surrounded by so many of the rest of us who consider Dave as a family. We mourn his loss and we celebrate his life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry. Next, I would like to introduce Margaret Weir, Professor of Political Science and International Public Affairs at Brown University.
Thank you, David. I was lucky enough to meet Dave at one of the very first political science meetings that I attended in the early 1980s. And I look forward to seeing him every year after that. We had many shared interests, and it was my good fortune to be moving along in my career at the same time that Dave was. Dave had a distinguished academic career, but what made him so special was the way he combined brilliant scholarship, institution building, and a big heart. As a scholar of American politics, Dave always kept his eye on the big questions and on policy problems that go to the core meanings of American democracy. In his dissertation on labor market policy and his historical book on labor and capital, Dave shined a light on power imbalances embedded in American institutions. He understood the critical importance of seemingly boring topics like federalism, showing why they matter for what government does. My copy of his book on federalism is full of post-it notes and ahas in the marginal comments. Dave's work was deeply scholarly, as best exemplified in his marvelous book, The Constitution and America's Destiny. His work was also always relevant to understanding contemporary politics. Dave believed that scholarship mattered. He provided a model of how to do scholarship that not only advanced our understanding of American institutions, but also showed us what those institutions mean for people's lives today. Dave was also an institution builder. I worked closely with him in the early days of getting the politics and history section off the ground. The section, which was so important to many scholars, thrives today because of the amazing work that Dave did in creating a scholarly community through his work as editor of our newsletter and his role as treasurer of the section for nearly 2 decades. His annual reports as treasurer somehow became the highlight of our annual meetings in the politics and history section. I can see everyone's faces smiling up as Dave gave his report. I think it was because he brought to those reports the traits that characterized his professional life, that rare blend of intelligence, warmth, and humor. Dave ended his book on federalism, calling it a summons to idealism. That phrase, I think, also is a way to reflect on Dave's legacy for us, a summons to idealism. We will cherish his memory, but also know that his ideas live on in his books, in the colleagues he inspired, in the students he taught, in the institutions he built, and not least in the many friends whose lives he touched. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. At this point, Kathy and Brian, do you want to share anything or?
Okay,
Yeah, you should.
yes, okay. I just want to thank everybody for participating and saying such marvelous words about David. We all miss him terribly. For those of you who don't know, his life ended, but we have a new life that began in our granddaughter Heidi, who was born a week ago. I'm saddened that David doesn't get to meet her, but I hope he's looking down on us. Thank you all for coming and participating.
Thank you, everyone, for just your wonderful words. I mean, you provided me a memory that will last in my lifetime. And it was just such a joy to hear all of your wonderful things that you were able to say about him, and know that that was a shared experience for me as well. So thank you for coming out today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Kathy and Brian. I want to thank all of our wonderful speakers today. I knew Dave as a trusted colleague, a campus leader, a mentor, and a dear friend. And what I've heard today shows the wide reach of the good that he has done for our discipline, for our campus, and so many people around the country and around the world. I also want to thank Laura Kilcullen and Adriana Udani for helping to host this event. I know this is a busy time of year for everyone, so thank you all for joining us for this celebration of the life of Dave Robertson. As Amy Freed told me, may his memory be a blessing. Please be safe, happy holidays, and best wishes for the new year. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Thank you, David.